Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism. And today we're going back to that relationship series, talk about the many different kinds of narcissistic relationship. And we're going to talk about one called the "Is this as good as it gets" relationship. So we can also call it the abnegation relationship, but I'll get to that in a minute. So I want you to take a minute and you drop in the comments if you want, how many of you are in narcissistic relationships where you know it's kind of miserable and unsatisfying and blah, and maybe even just awful and critical and joyless, but you stay in it because you think, maybe this is as good as it gets. Maybe this is all that I deserve, and that it would be arrogant to expect anything more. You may also be doubling down on this and thinking that you specifically don't deserve anything more because you aren't special enough. And so you sort of plod through the desolation of this kind of self-denying narcissistic relationship, not wanting to hold out for more, accepting that maybe that this is all that there is. And perhaps you're even concerned about, I don't want to be single, I don't want to be alone, and feeling like if I do that, I may be trading out one problem for another. So if that's you, like I said, drop it in the comments if you feel comfortable. There's a word out there that I just hinted at, but there's a word out there that most people don't use every day. It's called abnegation. And in its simplest form, it means self-denial. Now, if any of you ever saw the movie Divergent, there were different factions. One of the factions was called abnegation. And though that faction, they were defined as sort of being selfless and living in the most plain and simple kind of manner possible, like almost to the point of discomfort, like they wore gray clothes. And I don't even think they had mattresses on their beds kind of thing. That's what these relationships are, though, right? This kind of relationship I'm talking about. They're just uncomfortable. They're characterized by tremendous amounts of self-sacrifice. These relationships can almost look masochistic on the outside, but I don't actually think that that's a fair characterization of what this kind of relationship is, because I don't think that the person, the not narcissistic person in this relationship, is intentionally trying to bring pain on themselves. They may simply not have options, not think there are options, and really, like I said, have kind of accepted kind of this terrible path of this is all there is. And so I'm going to stay in this self-denying space. Unfortunately, on top of the messaging that many people who grew up in narcissistic family systems face, the idea that you're not good enough, and hearing that you're not good enough if you grew up in a narcissistic family, that may be communicated directly, literally to you, or indirectly in 1,000 small ways. But there's also this sense that you don't deserve anything more, and that you're almost programmed to settle if you come from a narcissistic family. So when you come from that kind of a narcissistic family, and then you get into an adult narcissistic relationship, which is kind of what's to be expected, and the relationship is terrible, which is kind of what's to be expected, you may find yourself kind of going with it on the premise that this is what it is. I mean, the model of marriage that you saw may not have been any much better than what you're experiencing in one of these abnegated relationships. You were told that you don't deserve more, and you just find yourself in a relationship, like I said, that's completely characterized by discomfort and by self-denial. Now, this idea of this relationship, the "is this as good as it gets" kind of relationship, it's a very kind of, it's a painful relationship to observe and watch. And I got to tell you, it's probably more painful to be in one of these relationships. I'm sure of that. Sometimes there are cultural reasons for this. Stigma about divorce, a stigma around about things like familial estrangement. Sometimes there's financial reasons that without that narcissistic person, there would be concerns about being able to make it financially, having a place to live, being able to pay the bills. There may be children and fears about what would happen to them. Or there may be other caregiving responsibilities, especially if you have this kind of, maybe this is as good as it gets kind of theme in a family relationship you have. It may be a long-time job that you're in that carries unique benefits or pension, or it may be a family business that you don't feel like you can step away from. So these are not only very stuck relationships, there is a really sad undercurrent that this is as good as it gets, kind of as a relationship gets kind of thing, and that there is no point in asking for anything more, and no entertaining of the idea that being alone would be better than being in this relationship, which again, that's part of the struggle here. Now, when you witness these kinds of, is this really as good as it gets relationships, the only way I can describe it is that they're just gray, sad. Nothing good really happens. There's no real love. There's no joy. There's no real laughter between the narcissist and the other people in the system. There's no pleasure. There's no affection. There's no cherishing. It's just typically people who are in these sad, interlinked lives. That's a life that's really designed to kind of attend only to the needs of the narcissistic person. The narcissistic person just takes and takes in these relationships, and then often criticizes or is cruel or invalidating to the other person. It's almost as though you can see the life being sucked out of the other person in this kind of relationship. I mean, to put it simply, these relationships are basically just psychological servitude. And the relationship becomes a kind of hair shirt that a person has to wear, right? A sort of suffering that they have to endure. And many times these relationships stay together on the basis of these ideas of duty or obligation, and sometimes on the basis of what feel like real viable options. Now, for someone who's in one of these relationships, it's almost like a low-grade depression takes them over. You just kind of go, it's an apathy, right? You may observe not only that someone in this kind of relationship is isolated by the relationship, but even sort of a self-imposed isolation. There can be a lot of shame in these relationships. And after sometimes years without joy or pleasure, other than, I don't know, maybe watching TV or reading a nice book, there isn't much else. The idea of seeking happiness or seeking joy almost seems silly to a person who finds themselves in one of these relationships. Now, the whole "is this as good as it gets" relationships, when I observe them, and I have observed them, they really, really break my heart, almost more than almost any of the other kinds. I hate seeing them because it really is like seeing somebody who's in some sort of prison. It's a place of little hope, of little goodness, and almost no joy. And the idea that a person got a message that somebody has to endure this gray, sad space, that this is all it will ever be. It's hard to take that in. It's hard to watch it, but it's not uncommon. And we can see these kinds of narcissistic relationships of this kind as a byproduct sometimes of culture in parts of the world where people have little choice in their marital partners and no options to get out once they are in a marriage. We can see this in situations where people are economically stuck. We can see this in situations where people are stuck because of abuse, violence, and fear. We can see this in places or subgroups where divorce and relationship dissolution is stigmatized. The outcomes for people in these relationships are rough. Being in this kind of relationship, should you come out of it or even be stuck in it, it's not good. It's things like depression and hopelessness, none of which is good for anyone's mental or physical health. In some cases, sometimes the fates line up and the person somehow gets out of one of these abnegated, is this good as it gets relationship. But if a person is in one of these relationships for long enough, they may not feel worthy of pursuing happiness, even when the relationship ends. It's that learned helplessness, right? These relationships and the low expectations that come along with them can really get under a person's skin and leave low expectations sort of dogging them in other areas of their life. If you grew up with parents in this kind of marriage, it can result in a pretty bleak outlook on long-term committed relationships or put you at tremendous risk of choosing an invalidating partner because you basically may be replicating the maybe this is as good as it gets cycle because that's what you're actually indoctrinated to believe. Catch yourself when you do that. Always remember that every person in the world is entitled to joy. This kind of relationship, this as good as it gets structure. It's a structure we may most likely witness when there's a vulnerable narcissist in the relationship or a neglectful narcissist or a malignant narcissist, sort of much more likely to be cold, invalidating, and take no notice of another person unless they need them. And some folks stay in these relationships simply because they don't want to be alone. And the attitude becomes, well, yeah, maybe this is as good as it gets, and maybe this may be better than alone. Trust me, it is not. But it may take you some time to get there and see that more clearly and cultivate different kinds of relationships. This isn't as good as it gets, despite the name of this relationship. There is more. And I hope everyone that's in one of these abnegated, good as it gets relationships someday can see that. Because this, to me, is actually one of the more bleak forms of narcissistic relationships. It's one we saw a lot more often in prior generations of just sort of relationship really being, especially long-term committed romantic relationships, really looking like indentured servitude with a wedding ring on it. So hope that helps. And if any of you are in these kind of relationships, drop them in the comments. Thanks again.